time to do it if you, but we're going to try to keep that conversation moving. So I'd like to ask our audience to turn on your videos, please, and to introduce yourselves as you ask any questions or make any comments. So when you speak, please do identify yourself. Hello, Gala. How are you? So good to see you.
Hi, Margot. Good to see you.
Please identify yourself. I already gave half of the name away.
Yes. So my name is Gala Diaz-Langu. I'm the Director of Social Protection at CPEC. I wanted first to congratulate you for an excellent panel and pose a quite specific question regarding domestic workers. This sector was already socially and economically vulnerable prior to the COVID crisis. And with the crisis, that vulnerability has all but increased. This is both because of the difficulties in implementing the paid leaves for this sector due to the high rates of informality in many countries of domestic workers, but also because of the difficulties that these workers have in accessing the banking system and remote paying systems. In Argentina particularly, this is a huge problem because it's almost 20% of the female working force in the domestic sector workers. So I wanted to ask the panel members and yourself, Margot, whether you knew any experiences that might help in terms of guaranteeing social protection for these workers during the COVID crisis, and how could the reopening of the domestic workers sectors be handled due to the restrictions that the crisis also poses for these types of workers. Thank you.
Thank you. Mariki, this is right in your bailiwick, isn't it?
Yeah, sure. So from exact responses during the COVID pandemic, I can't really speak that much, except that I have seen anecdotal data, interestingly, going in different directions where, like, for example, in Brazil, domestic workers were just in northern Brazil were just declared essential workers. So they get to keep their jobs. On the other hand, the motivation for it was because the elites feel that they can't survive without domestic workers. It wasn't really about protecting domestic workers. UN Women document talked about the fact that domestic workers should be considered essential workers, but with that, they should be provided the necessary protective gear to protect themselves. And so I think there's different ways to look at this in the immediate pandemic situation. More importantly, I think it's absolutely two things need to come together, I think. I mean, basically, as a result, the one positive thing I would hope that would happen after this pandemic is that governments realize that more risks need to be socialized to effectively respond to these kinds of global pandemics. And that goes through providing a basic social protection floor, basic social, essential social services. But getting to the basic social protection floor, there's two ways to get at vulnerable groups like domestic workers. One is very importantly through different ways to formalize the workforce, and some countries have had way more successful than others. And I know that Gala knows the case of Uruguay very well, which has been much more successful. Chile to a lesser extent, Brazil as well, Argentina less so. So that's one way. However, it's always going to be hard to get high rates of formalization in such, because people who employ domestic workers don't see themselves as employers. They just see hiring somebody to help them with their families. They don't see themselves as a firm, a for-profit firm that hires somebody. And so it's hard. Ultimately, the other way to go about protecting domestic workers is to universalize certain protections that shouldn't necessarily be tied to having a formal labor force job. And I think that's one of the things that perhaps, hopefully, this crisis in Latin America will bring home, that you can formalize the labor force, but on the other hand, what you need to do is provide more protection for more social risks through general tax revenue based simply on being a citizen, or more importantly, based on being a human being. And that's another issue. even in Latin America, most domestic workers are domestic. They're not migrants. But actually in Argentina, for example, as Gal I'm sure knows, quite a few of them are migrants. And for example, the emergency cash assistance that the current government in Argentina was very quick to provide to informal sector workers, to domestic workers who are not formalized, explicitly excluded migrants who haven't regularized their status and been in the country for more than 2 years. And those migrants need to eat just as much as anybody else does. And so I think especially it's very important in these kinds of policies to not restrict them on the basis of your migratory status.
Thank you very much. I think well stated. My only comment to that is, of course, we're seeing this in the context of Latin America, but we know that this is a global issue.
Yeah.
And very much an issue in the North and Western world, where a lot of migrant women fulfill those roles of providing care. And this is the whole care economy, I think, is going to evolve. And so we need to ensure that there are protections for those people. Anyone else in the audience at this stage like to comment or ask a question?
I think just in response
Yes,
that
please.
from a North American centric lens, that many of these workers have been deemed essential, particularly personal care workers, and that has led to wage subsidies. And I think if anything, this pandemic brings to the floor the dominant role of women in the healthcare
Yes.
system, the care economy, and the lack of response across the G20 economies to recognizing that gender play within the care economy, I think is startling and doesn't bode well to recovery policy. I think this is one of the roles of panels like this to really emphasize that we can't go back. We need to recognize and move forward.
Absolutely. And, you know, even within the formal health sector, there is, I think, a 28% gender wage gap. Yet women comprise I was shocked when I heard this, 70% of the global labor force in the health industry, health sector. So I really do hope that we can use this to propel change, especially with the global recognition of the issue. Anyone else, any thoughts, comments, or questions
Katisha,
from the audience?
can you hear me? It's
Yes.
Katisha.
Hello,
Hi.
Katisha. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Please identify yourself.
I am Katisha Ebron. I currently work with UN Women Egypt as a program analyst. And I had a question because you hear a lot of talk about how when the children go back to school, and they talk about this as if this is going to resolve some of the issues. It brings up more questions for me. How do we work with governments? Because a lot of times, if you're in a lower income area, the schools are already overcrowded. So there will be no social distancing. So it will not be as easy to bring those children back to school. Also, bringing them back to school, how are governments engaging with the women or civil society to see what are some realistic solutions that they need in order to continue working or providing for their families? And this is not a conversation that I've had heard anyone really speak about. You just automatically assume that because the children are back in school, that the problem of them having being able to work is done, but it's not. It doesn't help with that. And especially when you're trying to recover financially from not having work and then to going back into the workplace, you may want to work longer hours. How do you do this when you want to provide for your family as a single parent?
Thank you for that question, Kutisha. I just picked up an article, I think it was published 2 days ago, in which the title reads, after coronavirus, nearly half of the daycare centers in the US could be gone. So some of them are not even solvent. So I think your question though, apart from the social distancing within schools, really hinges around the care economy, how it's structured, how is it going to survive, and how it meets the needs of those working parents who need to provide care. Anyone on the panel with any thoughts? And I know within our listening audience, Gala has done and Florencia have written policy briefs on the care economy. So I would invite you to share your views on this as well, if you would. Anyone on the panel first? Any thoughts or responses?
Well, I think if I understood correctly, you weren't just talking about the care economy, but the fact that once kids go back to school, many of these parents will be unemployed simply because of the economic collapse, right?
Correct. And
Right.
still
Which
trying
leads
to find a way, yes.
Exactly. And so that's also, I mean, you have the care economy, but that's just beyond that as well. And so, yeah, I mean, I think economic rescue packages for especially lower and middle income countries and multilateral solutions to this. And part of that answer might have to, what I would love to see is some kind of basic income plan until people can get back on the feet and the economy can get going again. And that might take 6 months, that might take a year, that could take 5 years.
Serious issue.
I'd like to
Go ahead, please.
I'd like to make a quick point there, Margot, and thanks very much for that question. I think policy has a lot to play here, and it can be creative. So I think governments across the world, but I'm currently in Africa, we have to be looking at ways to broaden provisions for social services, and that point was alluded to earlier, in a way that lifts women care burden, you know, away from them. So such as creating flexible working arrangements, giving them the opportunity to reskill, to retool, to upskill. So if they're able to do part-time work, how can this be done? And governments really have a role to play with, you know, the way that they craft policy. And I think a question came out about Latin American care workers there. Governments really need to have to play this role to say, if you have these care workers, craft policy in a way that allows the care workers to go back to school or do part-time schooling so that they can come out of these spaces and obviously position for other jobs. So there's a whole lot the policy can do. Flexible working arrangements and social services have to be refocused and recrafted. That's the point I wanted to make.
Certainly, thank you. I fully agree. But I think the concern that this article is addressing is the fact that so far in the design and the recovery packaging that we're seeing coming out in the US, there's very little focus on this aspect of the issue and very little relief for some of the current providers of care. So I certainly agree that this needs to be brought into focus. Florencia, if you're still on, I know that you've written a policy brief and you've made some changes to your policy brief to account for the COVID in the care economy. Would you care to join to comment?
Yes, first I wanted to bring to the table two thoughts. Sorry?
Please
Can you hear me?
introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm Florencia Caro Sacchetti. I'm coordinator of gender equality projects at CPEC, a think tank based in Argentina. And I wanted to share two thoughts that I was thinking now about the thing of school closures and how this increases the burden of unpaid care work that women carry out. And first, I was thinking of which policies maybe government could implement to try to redistribute this burden between men and women, because we see that especially in developing countries now, it is families who are carrying out all this care. And how do we avoid this situation from becoming a setback in gender equality and putting an even heavier burden on women? And another thought I have been thinking lately is how everyone talks about the economic impact on the macroeconomy for all the countries and how GDP will decline because of this economic collapse. And something that I think could be interesting, and maybe this situation brings an opportunity to consider, is how much smaller would this decline be if we were counting unpaid work in GDP as a satellite account? So maybe this does bring an opportunity, and it could be interesting for countries to look at other best practices and experiences that already exist in some places, that if anybody wants to share about this this experience, it would be really interesting to know a little bit more about that. And regarding the policy brief that we worked on for the T20, this focuses on global care chains, and now these recommendations become ever more relevant because we connect towards of gender equality, care work, and also migration in a context of closed borders worldwide. So it is really important first to consider the 5 R's in the care framework to recognize, redistribute, and reward and the care work, because if not, like as we were talking before, we need to recognize the value socially and economically to sustain life of care work. We need to redistribute it between men and women. We need to reduce it, well, now it's quite difficult. And regarding care workers, we need to reward them and guarantee their representation. But at the same time, in this context, we need also to achieve policy coherence. Well, it is hard. We do know that we have now care workers who are maybe working informally in a country that is not theirs, and that creates even worse obstacles to the fulfillment of their rights.
Thank you very much, Florencia. Anyone else? Any thoughts, comments?
I think it's worth also thinking about the high school and post-secondary university communities as well. And you know, we're on lockdown, we'll maintain on lockdown. I think there is opportunity to improve the capacity of these institutions to deliver online content. Faculty are retooling. However, we know that students don't have the technology or sometimes the bandwidth or the capacity. So there's opportunities here for policy to enable tax credits and the gifting and buying of equipment to ensure that all students have equitable opportunities to participate on online learning.
Now I've got a comment too, just to build on and the last point there. I think in order to shift to a new model of shared responsibilities within households, government also has a huge role there to play. And it really comes down to the way in which policies are being crafted. How many opportunities are being granted to women? Again, going back to the points I made earlier, looking at procurement systems, making women have more sort of active participation in economic activities, you know, having the right sort of stimulus, fiscal and economic stimulus packages that basically allow an equal playing field for women. If governments can start crafting their policies, you know, in such a way that allow women to play, you know, on a sort of even keel, I think that this would you'd start to have a bit of a shift in households where you'd see women equally participating economically, but there would be the shared responsibility where when they're not there, then, you know, their other half could, you know, take on some of the care responsibilities. And this is the way to look at it. And whilst we're doing things on the private sector, we also have to start thinking, how is it that government's policies could start to help pivot some of the changes that we're trying to look for. And there's a whole you know, myriad of ways that governments can do this.
Of course, in the area of the shared responsibilities and the division of labor within households, I fully agree that governments and with policy can catalyze, but a large part of that rests on social norms and practices within cultural practices. And so it's really trying to just communicate and use the carrot and stick method, I think, while engaging extensively in order to help achieve those goals. Marika, I saw that your hand, you wanted to...
If I could add, I mean, I agree with all of that, and the fact that if women basically bring in more household income, going to Tuan's point, then men are more likely to pick up some of the slack at home. However, I think another important prong is, and what you mentioned, Margot, about like changing the cultural norms around what it means to be, for example, a parent. And I think they're also, because when we talk about household division of labor, we're assuming somewhat intact families where like the dad is around. And in Latin America, many countries, like the biggest increase is in basically female-headed households where the father has de-linked himself from his offspring. And there's actually a lot that government policy can do that I think is really important, because if you're a single mother, I mean, the burden of providing care and income on your own, as we all know, it's tremendous. And so just from starting from like paternal responsibility, I mean, in Latin America, about between 10 and 30% of children that are born don't have a legal father. There's ways that governments can highly increase the incentives to towards paternal recognition as a first step. Secondly, if the fathers don't stick around, or the mothers, child support policies. There's so much you can do to foster child support policies where the fathers maintain economic responsibility for their children, along with that also some kind of an emotional, mental connection, which, you know, overall, unless there's abuse, has been seen to be something that benefits children, right? And children, you know, children's rights conventions talk about children have a right to know both parents. So here, actually, I think government policies, and here you can be creative. And this is something that many governments have had a complete blind spot towards. So along with economic empowerment of women, I think there's other things that we can do to increase the caring responsibility and sort of the fact that men are part of the process of creating children, and then what happens afterwards.
Absolutely. Right. Florencia, I see that your hand is up. Thank you, Marika.
To add to that, I wanted to mention that last year, for example, we conducted a study in Buenos Aires that showed that men answered the day that care work inside their households was either evenly distributed or they did more than women. And in the context of the COVID pandemic, last week in the US, there was a survey also published that showed exactly the same. Like, men said either they did more or that it was even, while women said only, I think 3% of women were answering that it was true their partner did more. So it's important not only to change the reality, but also change the perception of how men think they contribute or not to the work. So I think that's quite a big challenge.
Fully agree. I don't know if Myra is still on the line, but this is where, you know, the data collection is so important. And I know Fernando Filgaria, many times we've had these conversations. He's spoken on my panels in Berlin, and this is where he talks about time use surveys within households and finding ways to unearth it. And again, that's the role of government, because these are levers, to Marika's point, that can be used to help to push that cultural discussion by breaking some of these standing perceptions that enforce roles and the understanding of what shared responsibilities are about. So really, thank you for making that point. The other thing that I heard in the discussion is something that I failed to mention at the beginning, because of course there's SDG Goal 5, it's about women's economic empowerment. But as we've noted before, and the current Secretary General has said many times, you cannot really achieve any of the other SDGs without attending to SDG 5. It is transversal in many respects. And I think was a point that Marika was making. If we really want to grow the economy, we've got to find ways to enable women to really optimize their contribution. And we're not very good at doing that right now. I'm mindful of the time. So anyone in the audience, any other thoughts or comments at this stage that you would like to make?
I would just like to say something I'm looking into at the moment in terms of the current pandemic.
Please identify yourself.
Hello, Dinah Bennett. I'm from International Consultants for Entrepreneurship and Enterprise, and also the lead for enterprise development at the Women's Economic Imperative. It's really great to be part of this discussion. I really enjoyed your contributions. Looking at some of the emergency measures being taken in the pandemic, I've been trying to get some gender disaggregated data from what's going on. So in India, for example, they have a biometric system where they're paying 500 rupees into every individual's account, which is commendable. But again, women have become quite invisible in some respects, particularly those trafficked or those that aren't on the government database. In Kenya, cash payments are being made, but they're being made to the heads of households. Now, we all know that research has shown that if you actually give money to the heads of household, which is usually termed as the man, the male head of the household, it doesn't actually trickle down to the women and the children. And it concerns me that in terms of policies and measures, that institutional memory, because we have had incidences with SARS, with Ebola, and other pandemics, why aren't people remembering how to actually deal with this? And we're seeing that women are becoming invisible yet again during this emergency crisis.
Thank you. Marika, I'd love to hear your response to that, because of what have been some successful efforts in distributing social benefits in Mexico, for example. I don't know if you can speak to that, Marika.
Well, I can speak to the fact that in Latin America, the cash transfer programs, I think in all cases, the preference is to give it to the mother. And so in some cases, it would go to the father, but the preference is always the mother. And largely, they were designed instrumentally with the fact that that's the best bang for the buck in terms of investment in children, right? Now, of course, a welcome side effect of that has been women's empowerment, right? Income-wise. So I would love to know more, actually. You mentioned Kenya. I would love to know more about these kinds of cash transfer programs in other parts of the world. And I actually wanted to ask, this program in India, what is the reach of that program? Because you said that women might not end up getting these transfers, even though there's based on like individual. Because I mean, if they go to the head of the household, then it's only one person in the household. But in India, if it's based on the individual, then ostensibly they should be universal to adults. And so my question would be, do you know more about who are actually getting those transfers?
What's being shown is that those women that are biometric database, and that usually is mostly women, particularly sex workers and those who have been trafficked.
Okay.
They're getting nothing.
They're getting nothing. Okay, yeah. No, that's a huge problematic.
Well, I've just got an intervention there, because we also in Rwanda are looking at running cash transfer.
I hear you very well.
We're looking at running cash transfer solutions as part of our recovery planning, and the sort of economic SME resilience fund. One of the ways in which we've been advising governments is to look at ways to basically invest in a well-run financial system and institution that supports and broaden access to financial facilities for women. And some of the ways to do that is looking at the sort of leadership at the helm of these institutions. Having female participation really gives a different kind of perspective to things, and they're able to bring to bear their understanding of the challenges that women are facing, unlike the male counterparts. And so having them either run an institution like that or deputize will help to provide, more advocacy space, because they're able to drive home those real challenges that their female counterparts are facing. And these are the kinds of, solution and advice that we give to governments. In particular places, microfinance loan institutions have either women deputizing or have them, at the helm of affairs. And this is no no pun intended to the male counterpart, but you need to have women in some of these spaces so they can drive through delivery for women.
Fully agree. Voice and representation. And we have to really consider meaningful representation in terms of developing, identifying issues, and designing and delivering on solutions. Fully agree. Thank you very much for that, Toyin. Anyone else? Last question or comment?
I think I'm going to pick up on that point, because with that recommendation, we know, regardless of country, that if it's a mainstream small business program, women, particularly in rural and remote areas, will not have access to funding, to technology, and to business support. So the idea of having advisory boards of women tagged to all major market interventions, I think makes a lot of sense. Because if we don't, we know the likely impact of that. And I think there's a level of irresponsibility now when we know the likely outcome of not having that kind of women-focused advisory support.
Mhm. And I would advocate to have the similar kind of, really an inclusive approach to policy making. We actually wrote a policy brief on that. I led the writing of that 2 years ago because, you know, when it comes to infrastructure, it's been shown, when these things are, these projects are designed by men, they're invariably designed for men, where you put roads and who uses them and how you provide public access. But my very favorite one is what I think we're all aware of, the design of seatbelts. Were designed by men for men's bodies, until we saw the spike in the mortality rates of pregnant women in motor car accidents that led to some adjustments to take these things into account. So there's, to Dinah's point, the invisibility of women and how the ideas and the solutions are designed really requires a rethinking in assuring a more inclusive approach, not just within government, but across society. I'd like to thank you all.
Margot, just a quick point, not to also talk about the fact that women in these very high-level roles would serve as role models for other women who are trying to get there and who are collectively trying to drive the greater good for women altogether.
Yes, indeed. So once again, I want to say thank you. I really look forward to sharing this discussion with the audience and the panel. You will hear more from me, but I do want, anybody who knows me, I always end up with a little project. So I would like, if anyone would volunteer to help us come up with a call to action based on what we've heard in the panel and in the audience participation discussion, because we can post this with the panel discussion on the GSS website. And it's another way in which we could exercise our voice on these issues. So once again, I do want to thank you. I'll follow up by email on my little suggestion. And I think we can do this something very quickly, that by the end of the weekend, we can have something coherent. It doesn't have to be a long document, it could be one page. Thank you all. It's been a pleasure and an honor to facilitate this discussion. And I look forward to acting as best, each of us acting, taking action